Okay, as you can see, it is camera day, and there are a lot of different types of cameras. So how do you learn how to use a camera? Do you have a DSLR? Do you have a camcorder? Do you have a hybrid camera? Which one do you want to learn how to use? How am I going to teach you how to use all these cameras? Well, I'm not. I'm going to give you some lessons that you can apply to any camera that you come across, because you know what? They've all got a lot of things in common. So let's get started. Let's start with turning the camera on. Although finding the power switch sounds very simple, it will obviously be in different places on different cameras. Some cameras turn on automatically when you open the viewfinder. Some have buttons, others have switches. I love to tell the story that one time it took me 10 or 12 minutes to find the power switch on a new camera I was using, right in front of the students. But of course, before you turn the camera on, it needs to have power. All cameras will run on batteries, and most of them have a power supply. The key to installing the battery is to look for the contact point on the battery and the contact point on the battery chamber, and then line them up. Most of the time, installing the battery is very simple, but it can be tricky. Some batteries need to be slid into position carefully because they have small pins as contact points. And if you bend the pin, you can't power the camera with the battery. Most DSLRs have very straightforward battery compartments. Using the power supply can come in handy when you're on a job that requires long recording times. Most power supplies come in two pieces. One end plugs into the wall and the other end plugs into the camera, and the two pieces usually are joined together in a 2-pin power connection. The next thing to consider is the SD card. Each brand of camera will record its own format, or codec. You'll learn more about that in the class. Some of them are the same format, but it's best to assume that if you own different brands of cameras, you will need to assign a different SD card to each one. The card needs to be formatted for the camera in which it's used. Sometimes you can use one SD card in several different cameras, but it's not a good idea to count on that. If you have a brand new SD card or an SD card that was used in a different camera, it's possible the camera will ask you to format the card. This is something you should always check the day before a shoot. Formatting a card will erase everything on it. Let me say that again so that I know you have it. Formatting a card erases everything on it. Some cameras have the option to restore an SD card or refresh it. That means that something is wrong with the information on the card and the camera simply needs to rewrite the directory. Kind of like a digital inventory of what's on the card and how the information is organized. It will not erase what's there. It will just make an accounting of what is on the card. But don't ever confuse restore or refresh with format. By the way, the SD card will only go in one way because there's contact pins on one side of it and not the other. Now let's talk about lenses. Your camera will either have a modular lens or a replaceable lens. The modular lens is attached to the camera permanently. A camera with replaceable lenses will need to use lenses that have the proper mount for that camera. If not, you need to buy an adapter so that you can put your Canon lens on your Nikon camera as an example. Your lenses will either be prime lenses or zoom lenses. You'll learn more about that in the class, but to be brief, the prime lens has a fixed focal length, so it cannot zoom, and a zoom lens has a variable focal length, so it can zoom in and out. Replaceable zoom lenses will need to be zoomed manually unless you buy a zoom controller. All modular lenses are zoom lenses and usually can be zoomed manually or with a servo motor. Sometimes there is more than one servo zoom control on a camcorder, and some cameras have programmable speed control for one of the servo zooms. There are 5 video settings that can traditionally be automatic or manual. 3 of the settings have to do with exposure, or the brightness of your image. 1 has to do with the color of your image, and the other one is focus. The 3 settings regarding exposure are the aperture, also called the iris, the shutter speed, and the ISO, also referred to as gain on a camcorder. There's one function on some cameras related to exposure which is not automatic manual. It's either on or off, and that's the ND filter. ND stands for neutral density, and it's basically sunglasses for the lens. Some cameras have an internal ND filter, and if yours does not, it will need to be added in front of the lens with a matte box. Sunglasses are obviously only used when you're shooting out in bright sunlight. it helps with contrast ratio, which you'll learn more about in the class. The video setting regarding color is color balance, most commonly referred to as white balance. And focus is, well, focus. There's also an audio setting that can be either automatic or manual, and that is the volume control. I'm not going to cover volume control in this camera tutorial, but I will say that you should never, never, never use automatic volume control. It makes the sound really loud when no one is talking, and then really lowers it down if someone speaks loudly. It's awful. Don't use it. Set your audio levels manually, period. To adjust the aperture, which is the opening in the lens that allows light to hit the image sensor, also called the iris, since that's what it's called in your eye, you will turn a dial or move a ring on the lens. Some DSLRs will have control of the aperture on the LCD screen. The aperture opening is measured in f-stops or f-numbers. You'll learn all about that in class, but suffice to say here that the f-numbers are upside down. The bigger the f-number, the smaller the lens opening. The shutter speed is the time in which the aperture is open. You will not see a shutter speed ring on the lens. You will either turn a dial, push a button while turning a dial, or use a joystick and navigation buttons to adjust the shutter speed. Some cameras have more than one dial that controls different settings. DSLRs are usually used in either aperture priority or shutter priority. When in aperture priority, you set the aperture you want, and the camera automatically sets the shutter speed to make the shot exposed properly. Shutter priority is just the opposite. You rarely will find yourself shooting with aperture and the shutter speed in automatic. And then there's the third setting that has to do with brightness, ISO or gain. The ISO, or gain as it's referred to in camcorders, is an electronic amplification of the image's brightness. You'll learn more about that in class, but for now, just know that it's not something you want to use if you don't have to. It's controlled either by a switch, a dial, or with a menu item. You should always start with your gain or ISO at its lowest possible setting, and then only turn it up when absolutely necessary. In terms of white balance or color balance, some cameras require you to put something white in front of the camera and then push a manual white balance button. Color processing in video uses additive color, which means white is created by joining all the colors in the spectrum. So when you show the camera white, it sees all colors and can then calibrate the proper color. On most DSLRs, white balance is a setting in your menu. You will see a lot of options with icons like a sun, a light bulb, or a cloudy sky. There are also several settings for fluorescence, which can be confusing. Using automatic white balance can work well in some cameras, but not so great in others. If you're not white balancing the camera manually, choose the white balance that makes your image look as close to real as you can get, and then you can make slight adjustments to the color in post-production. Focus is pretty straightforward. Every camera will have a focus ring on the lens, which allows you to set the focus manually. Automatic focus can be achieved by flipping a switch or touching your LCD screen or holding down a button. There will be auto manual switches on the camera and on the lens, which can make things confusing. So check out all the different combinations and make sure you completely understand how your camera is handling focus. So awareness of all 5 video functions that can be set to automatic or manual and how to manipulate them is a huge part of learning any camera. In terms of audio, if your camera has balanced XLR audio inputs, you can feel free to plug your microphone directly into your camera. But if your camera, most likely a DSLR, has an 1/8 inch or 35mm headphone jack input, it is strongly recommended that you record your audio on a separate recording device like a Zoom or Tascam. The mini plug inputs to the DSLR cameras are often unmanageable in volume control, and sometimes you cannot monitor them with headphones. Remember, hope is a bad plan, so don't ever just plug a mic in and hope that it's recording and sounding okay. Make sure you are recording your audio professionally into a device in which you can control the level and monitor the signal. Camcorders with XLR inputs usually come with a camera-mounted mic for ambient sound recording. The main audio can then be plugged into the second channel. You will learn more about the audio setup of the camera in class, but just know that there are critical settings regarding the type of input, powering the microphone, and setting and monitoring the audio levels. Let's talk about menus. They can be overwhelming, but keep in mind there are only so many menus and each menu only has so many items. Also, a lot of the menu items are things you will never need to worry about. The best advice I can give you is go through each one and figure out what it does. If you can't figure out what it does, you probably don't need it. There is also the option to set F keys or function keys. These F keys can be customized to the things you use most, so you don't have to go to a menu to adjust them. One habit that's really good to get into when you're starting is to make note of the settings of your camera before you start to shoot. Things like the focal length of the lens, f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, and whether you're shooting in auto or manual focus, or aperture priority or shutter priority. Very quickly you will acquire the good habit of being aware of the settings on your camera. I want to talk a little bit about cell phones because so many people are shooting with them. The quality of the video is getting better and better. Obviously you want to shoot horizontally, not vertically.
Cue the pigeon.
There are microphones that can be plugged directly into a cell phone that work really well. What you do need to watch out for is what type of plug your phone needs. There are TRS plugs, TRRS plugs, and lightning plugs. Make sure you know which plug the microphone has and which input your phone has so you can buy the proper adapter if needed. In terms of the video, your phone will not be able to zoom without severely pixelating the image. But you can buy lenses for your cell phone now, so that's a very good option if you are stuck using a cell phone for a long period of time. Most cell phones will shoot in automatic mode only, so you won't have much control over the exposure, the white balance, or the focus unless you have some advanced functions on your phone. Just remember to keep it steady just like any other handheld shot. So there you have it. Hopefully you can use those lessons to apply to any camera that you come across. And here's a good piece of advice for you. No matter what, get the manual, sit down with the camera, and go through the manual page by page, setting by setting, button by button, and just figure it all out for that particular camera. And no matter what, you're going to learn something every time you learn how to use a new camera. So just explore, have fun, don't be intimidated, and always embrace needing to learn something new, and you'll be a very versatile videographer in no time.